Have you ever been so lost that you felt even the dirt road under your feet was tired of you? So broken that you stopped waiting for help because you just figured no one was coming? That's where our story starts, out on the ragged edge of the world, where the fence posts lean and the wind bites. Most folks think salvation has to arrive with a shout or maybe a flash of light. But sometimes, salvation rides quiet. Sometimes, it's just the creak of an old leather saddle, the sound of a patient horse, and the promise of one good man who decides that today he's going to stay. This is a story about a woman who had nothing left and the silent cowboy who gave her everything. The Rescue and the Sanctuary. The sun was pale that day, weak and dusty, hidden behind a curtain of yellow grit. If you didn't know this country, you'd think James was lost. But James never rushed. He rode slow, letting his mare choose the pace. He was a man made of habit, and silence was his oldest one. He hadn't spoken in 3 days, not even to his horse. There just hadn't been a reason to waste the air. But then he heard it. It wasn't a loud noise, not a shout or a scream. It was just a soft, hitched sound, like the wind catching something thin and hollow. James stopped his mare, turning his head, listening to the vast, empty quiet of the world. Then it came again, a tiny, newborn whimper, thin as a winter's edge. He dismounted and walked toward a stand of dried sage and old, rotting fencewood. The air here smelled of rust, neglect, and pine tar. And that's when he saw her. Nora. She was tied to a splintered post, upright, arms pulled hard behind her back. Her dress was ripped, and there was dried blood darkening her temple. She was a woman who was full of life, with those generous, soft curves her late husband had loved so much, but which his family had always mocked. Now, that figure just sagged against the ropes that cut into her wrists. Her eyes were open, but empty, just staring into the coming dusk. And at her feet, wrapped tight in a faded horse blanket, was the source of the noise. An infant boy, just a day or two old, pink-cheeked, sucking weakly on the corner of the cloth. He was already worn out by the world. Schneid. James didn't speak. He crouched down. Nora's dry lips cracked open, and a sound like gravel scraped through. Don't take him! It was a plea of pure exhaustion. James didn't say a word. He just pulled out his hunting knife and, moving with a slowness that was pure respect, he cut the ropes. Her hands dropped like stones. She swayed once, twice, and then just collapsed. He caught her. She was soft, yielding, but so light from hunger. Her body trembled against his chest. He looked down the hill, an old homestead half collapsed with a thin wisp of smoke still in the chimney. They had been here. The rope burns were too fresh, the boot prints too harsh. The story of violence was written right there in the mud. James secured the baby first. He wrapped the child in a saddle blanket and tied it carefully across his chest. Then he lifted Nora, carrying her like she was the most fragile, breakable thing in the entire world. "You're coming with me," he said. Not loud, not a demand, just steady, like a promise you knew he would keep. She didn't answer, but her fingers, weak as fallen leaves, clutched at his shirt. The ride back was painful and slow. James walked his mare all the way to keep the baby from jostling. Nora's head rested against his chest. Snowflakes started to fall, lazy, wide flakes that melted on eyelashes. When they reached his cabin, the sky had completely folded in on itself. It was a small place, one room, a stove in the corner, a cot by the window. James kicked the door open with his boot. Inside, the warmth hit them like a whisper, soft and real. He moved with an efficiency that told you he'd spent his life looking after himself. He laid Nora down on his cot, then checked her for injuries, more bruises than cuts. Her ankles were raw. One eye was already starting to swell. He saw the tear in her dress, but looked away, covering her with a handmade quilt. Then he built the fire high. He mixed his last bit of goat's milk with rainwater and warmed it. The baby drank greedily, tiny fists flailing, eyes fluttering closed. Sight. Only when the child slept did James finally sit back. He didn't sleep that night. He just sat by the fire, watching Nora's chest rise and fall. Her name was still unknown, her story a mystery. But it didn't matter. Not yet. He just remembered the look on her face when he found her. Not fear, not even shame, but pure, absolute surrender. A woman who had simply stopped expecting anyone to help. In the gray hush of the morning, Nora stirred. She groaned once and turned her head toward the makeshift cradle, where the baby was swaddled in James's old shirt. Her eyes finally opened, soft and brown as creek water. She looked at James, who was crouched nearby, still in yesterday's clothes, quiet as a stone. She took in the cabin slowly, like she was waking up in a life that wasn't hers. "You didn't leave us," she whispered, the simple words catching in her throat. He shook his head. She tried to rise, wincing. Her voice cracked again, harder this time. They said, this baby isn't theirs. Said I was carrying on behind my husband's back. Said I wasn't worth the food to keep us both alive." The shame of it was still heavy in her voice. James didn't give her pity. He dipped a cloth in warm water and offered it. She pressed it to her swollen cheek with trembling fingers. Then she looked at him fully. "You're not afraid of what people say? Taking in a woman like me with a baby they claim has no rightful name?" James simply tilted his head. "You're safe. That's all that matters." The disbelief in her eyes softened. He didn't press her for more. He just stood, stoked the fire, and laid out bread. He moved around the room like a man who had been alone for years, but who hadn't let that solitude make him cruel. "My name's Nora," she whispered. James turned, nodding. "James," he answered. "That's all. No family name, no town. Just James." The quiet stretched out, but it wasn't awkward. It was a peaceful silence, like the space before a question that doesn't need to be answered. The passing days. For the next 6 days, the fire never went out. James rose before the sun to add wood in the pale blue quiet of dawn. He stirred the embers at dusk. He fed the fire between chores without being asked. Nora noticed every single thing. She noticed how he stepped outside the moment she needed to nurse the baby or change her torn dress. He gave her space like it was a sacred gift, never watching, never rushing her back into the world. The bruises on her neck slowly turned from purple to yellow and then faded. Her wrists began to heal. She started to move with less pain. She wore his spare flannel shirt and a skirt she'd stitched together from 2 pillowcases. She didn't complain that it didn't fit her generous figure right. She just wore it with quiet pride. She named the baby Thomas after his father and called him her little snowbird. James did small things that spoke volumes. One morning, Nora found a wooden rattle on the windowsill. James had carved it from pine scraps, detailing small, delicate flowers on the handle. He didn't say anything when she found it. Her hand just hovered over it, and for a moment, her mouth parted like she might finally cry, but she didn't. She just tucked it into the cradle. That was how they spoke now, in small, deliberate gestures. Every day, James rode out before noon. He always returned by dark, bringing back feed, chopped wood, or tiny bits of cloth from town. Nora never asked what he did, but she wondered. She wondered if he was doing ranch work or if he was just riding the perimeter, keeping their presence quiet, protecting them. Silence had a way of building like a storm cloud, and she knew the town wouldn't stay quiet forever. The cowboy's true value. The world outside loved stories where a poor widow and her kids saved a dying rich cowboy. What he did for the family will amaze you, and maybe that would have been an easier tale for her family to swallow. They wanted a wealthy savior who could instantly give the baby a rightful name. But James wasn't rich, and he wasn't dying. He was just a strong, quiet man who offered only what he had: safety. One morning, Nora asked if he needed help. He looked at her with that long, steady gaze, unsure how to answer. Then he just handed her a bucket and nodded toward the well. She smiled for the first time in days. The weight of the bucket in her hands felt grounding. Her body was still soft, still the shape that had drawn cruel words, but her steps grew firmer, filled with purpose. Outside, the air smelled of thawing snow. As Nora turned back from the well, she saw her, Mrs. Evelyn Parrish. Evelyn stood near the road with her mule, her face a living question mark. She was the kind of widow who thought her presence was a gift. She had sharp eyes and whittled down lips, and she never took off her bonnet. "Well now," Evelyn said, her eyes already scanning the cabin and the baby clothes drying on the porch line. "You look far too alive for someone buried by her husband's kin." Nora tightened her grip on the bucket. Evelyn stepped closer, her voice dropping low and sharp. Is James inside? People are talking, Miss Nora, about him keeping you here, with a baby that's got no rightful name. His name is Thomas, after his father, Nora said, her voice shaking but firm. Evelyn sniffed. A name don't carry much if the child's got no claim, dear. They're saying that baby came awful quick after your husband passed. Or awful late, depending on how you count. She smirked, twisting the knife. Tell James I brought flour. Thought he might need it. Feeding 2 mouths that ain't his responsibility. She mounted her mule and rode off slowly, deliberately, leaving Nora with the sting of shame burning her ears. James came out moments later, having seen the whole exchange from the window. He didn't ask what was said. He just took the bucket and carried it inside. That night, Nora sat by the fire long after the baby slept. James was quietly fixing a hinge on the door. Finally, she broke the silence. They'll never stop reminding me, she said, staring into the flames, that I don't belong, that Thomas, that he's somehow wrong. James didn't stop working. You belong here. She shook her head. Not here, not in this town, not anywhere. They look at me and see a woman too big to be desired, too poor to be respected, too broken to be believed. He laid the hinge down gently. I don't answer to towns. You don't know what it's like, she insisted, her hands curled tight in her lap. To be called a liar about your own child. To have them say he's a bastard because they can't believe any man would want me faithful. James looked at her, and in the slowest, calmest voice, he said, I know what it's like to be alone so long, you stop hearing your own name. He continued, his eyes steady on hers. I know what it's like to have people point at your silence and call it wrong, to be stared at like a question no one wants answered. The fire crackled between them. I ain't never had to raise a baby, he nodded toward the cradle, but I know enough to see he's not a curse, and I know enough to see you're not what they say you are. His eyes were steady, burning with a quiet truth. He reached into his coat and slid something across the table. It was a small jar of sweet cream from town. I heard you missed it, he said softly. Nora pressed her lips together. She didn't cry. She just nodded once, taking the jar in both hands like it was something holy. She was tired of fighting the small battles. She was tired of running. The real trouble rode up the trail on a Tuesday morning when the mist was still thick and clinging to the pines like secrets. Nora saw them first, standing at the kitchen window, 3 figures on horseback, shadowed by the fog. One wore a brown coat she remembered well, her brother-in-law Matthew. The others were cousins, rough men with scarred hands and colder eyes. All carried rifles. 30, 55. She dropped the cloth she was holding. Her hands started to tremble. The baby stirred in his cradle, sensing her fear. James stepped onto the porch before they reached the gate. He didn't take his rifle. He just leaned against the post, arms crossed. His presence was a wall, quiet and unmovable. The men halted 10 paces out. Matthew spat into the dirt. His eyes found Nora through the window. That woman inside belongs to our family, he growled, and that bastard child she's claiming carries our blood. That's so, James answered, his voice flat. Matthew's jaw worked. We don't want no trouble. We just came to take back what's ours. She's not yours, James said. She's not a thing to claim. She was married to my brother, Matthew spat, and that brat's got his last name, if it's even his. Then your brother should have stayed alive, James replied. A long, dangerous pause stretched in the silence. One of the cousins clicked the hammer on his rifle. Matthew sneered, jerking his chin toward Nora. Look at her. You think my brother would have touched that? She's twice the size she was when he married her. Eating us out of house and home. That baby came too early or too late. Either way, it ain't ours to feed. Nora stared out the window, expecting her in-laws to spin the kind of scandalous tale the town would eat up. The kind you hear about in whispers. The kind that might be titled, A Widow's Secret Night with a Drifter That Changed Everything. But James was giving her a new story. A quiet one built on simple defense, not wild betrayal. I don't want to see this go ugly, Matthew warned, but his hand was already on his gun. James stared at him with that same quiet steadiness. Neither do I. Then James straightened up from the post. He walked toward them, slowly, deliberately. No gun, no anger, just steps, heavy with intention. You ride down this hill now, he said, his voice soft but carrying, or I bury 3 more men before supper. Matthew hesitated, his face burning. She ain't worth it, rancher. Women like her, they ruin good men. Mark my words. She'll run off with the first man who'll have her. Leave you holding another man's bastard. 36, 30. James didn't blink. She's still more woman than you'll ever be man. That was the last straw. Matthew yanked his reins and spun his horse. The cousins followed, 3 dark silhouettes swallowed slowly by the mist and the trees. James watched them go. He stood silent for a long moment, a simple man who had just risked everything for someone else. When he finally came inside, Nora hadn't moved from the window. Her breath had fogged the glass. I didn't ask you to fight for me, she whispered. I didn't do it for you, he replied. She turned, startled. He looked at her, his eyes steady and kind. I did it because no one should ever have to beg to be left alone. She swallowed. Her voice broke. They'll come back, I know. Next time, they'll bring more men. They'll say I seduced you, that I'm using you to hide my shame. James walked to the stove and poured warm water into her cup. You're not something, he said. You're someone. I'm tired of running, she admitted, closing her eyes. Then stop, he said. His voice was so simple, so sure, it felt like a truth the earth had known long before her. The choice and the vow, the next test, came a few days later. A letter arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a clerk on a stubborn mule. It was from a cousin on Nora's mother's side, one of the few blood ties that hadn't completely vanished. Word had traveled about her situation. The cousin offered her a place, a house, a nursemaid for the baby, a claim of inheritance from a forgotten grandfather, comfort, a new start, with a new name for the child, a life without James. Nora held the letter like it might catch fire. When she showed James, he just read it once, folded it, and handed it back with a nod. He didn't ask her to stay. He didn't even say her name. He simply stepped outside and began to prepare her horse. By noon, her bag was packed. She sat with it on the porch beside the cradle, watching the sun stripe the trees. The baby napped peacefully. James returned from the barn and placed a small parcel beside her. Cheese, bread, water, a spare wool blanket. He didn't sit. You'll be all right, he said. And you? She asked. He looked toward the distant ridge. I was all right before. She flinched. Not at the words, but at the kindness he still managed to speak them with. You're not going to stop me? He shook his head. Was never my place. She stared down at the baby. He likes it here. He'll like wherever you are. She stood up, unsure of how her legs moved. Every step felt heavy, like her bones knew something her heart hadn't caught up with. At the edge of the porch, she turned back. Do you want me to go? He met her gaze, and this time, something cracked in his face. Not weakness, just truth. I want you to stay, he said, but only if it's what you want. Her throat tightened. And if I stay? I'll build you a life, he whispered. A quiet one you don't have to survive. Her knees nearly gave way. He looked down at the baby, sleeping peacefully. You've got a son that needs a man who'll watch over him like sunrise and supper. And I've got hands that ain't done nothing good until you put them to work. She laughed, the sound choked with tears. He stepped toward her then, for the first time, not with stillness, but with a fire in his chest. I don't have a ring, he said, his voice low, but I've got a home that knows your name, and a fire that waits for your hands to stoke it. That's what I can give you. She dropped her bag. The sound was soft but final. Then her face crumpled, not in sorrow, but in surrender, to hope, to safety, to him. When James reached out, she didn't flinch. She walked into his arms like a woman who finally believed she deserved to be held. He held her not tight, but full, present, like he was making space for every part of her. The broken bits, the strong bits, the parts still learning how to breathe. The wedding happened 3 days later. The preacher was old and hard of hearing, and he asked Nora to speak louder twice. She did, with a trembling voice that finally knew what it meant to promise. James said nothing fancy. He just looked at her like she was the only thing left that made sense in the world and murmured, I choose you every day, even the hard ones. They kissed. The baby squealed. The pine trees bowed slightly in the cool breeze. That night, they sat on the porch beneath a sky littered with stars. James leaned back, his boots off, his hands behind his head. Nora sat cross-legged beside him, the baby asleep in her lap. "You never told me what you wanted," he said finally. "Not once." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "That's because no one ever asked. I'm asking now." She smiled. "I want days that aren't loud. I want bread that rises and a son who doesn't learn to hide. I want a man who doesn't make me earn safety." He nodded. "Then that's what we'll build." The fire inside the cabin burned low but steady. The wind had changed. It no longer howled at the eaves like a wounded thing. It sighed, soft and low, like the land itself was finally resting. And in that quiet, Nora breathed easier. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was surviving in someone else's shadow. She was home. And that's the tale of James and Nora, a story built on silence, kindness, and a steady heart. If this narrative of quiet courage and second chances stirred something in you, let me know in the comments below. And if you want more deeply humanized stories of the Wild West and beyond, remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'm Iron Veil Narratives, and I'll see you next time.